Hello and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we venture into the fog of history, where legend and truth often blur. So find a comfortable spot and settle in. If you enjoy our journey into the past, please consider subscribing to the channel. And feel free to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a pleasure to see our community of history lovers from across the globe. Now let the world outside fade away. Let's begin our quiet exploration of historical tales that were more real than you might imagine. Imagine a fleet of wooden ships sailing on the dark waters of the Mediterranean. An enemy force approaches confident in its numbers and strength. Suddenly, the lead ship erupts in a torrent of liquid fire. This flame is unlike anything normal. It clings to wood and water with equal fury. This sounds like a scene from a fantasy epic. For centuries, many historians thought it was just a dramatic embellishment from old chronicles. A fire that burns on water seems impossible, a myth made to inspire terror. Yet, this terrifying weapon was entirely real. It was known as Greek fire, or sometimes sea fire. This was the secret weapon of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Roman glory. For nearly 1,000 years, the Byzantines guarded their capital of Constantinople. Greek fire was their ultimate naval deterrent. It was a technological marvel that gave their smaller fleets a devastating advantage. It struck fear into the hearts of Arab navies, Slavic raiders, and even crusading knights. This weapon was their guardian flame. The deployment of Greek fire was a spectacle of organized chaos. Byzantine warships, called dromons, were fitted with bronze tubes or siphons on their prows. These devices were operated by a crew of specialists. Using a complex pump mechanism, they would project a stream of the volatile liquid onto enemy vessels. The substance would ignite upon contact with the air. It created a roaring inferno that was nearly impossible to control. The sight of a ship spewing fire must have seemed like a dragon brought to life. The effects were nothing short of apocalyptic for those on the receiving end. Greek fire was a sticky substance that adhered to any surface. It clung to the hulls of ships and the bodies of sailors. Trying to douse it with water was a fatal mistake. Water often seemed to make the flames burn even more intensely. The only way to extinguish it was with sand, vinegar, or urine. The ensuing panic and destruction could shatter an entire fleet's morale in minutes. The exact chemical formula for Greek fire is one of history's most enduring mysteries. The Byzantines guarded the recipe as a state secret of the highest order. Knowledge of its production was passed down through a single family and known only to the emperor. Historians believe it was a petroleum-based mixture. It likely contained ingredients like naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, and pine resin. But because the secret was kept so well, the precise recipe was lost forever when the empire fell. We know Greek fire was real because of the sheer volume of historical accounts. Byzantine records describe its strategic importance. More compelling are the writings of their enemies. Arab chroniclers wrote with horrified awe about the liquid fire that turned sea battles into hellscapes. They described its thunderous noise and the thick smoke that accompanied the flames. These terrified accounts from multiple sources confirm that the legend was a terrifying reality. The myth of a fire that could not be quenched was finally proven true by those who faced it. Let us now turn our attention from the sea to the courthouse. Picture a solemn courtroom in 14th century France. A judge sits robed and serious. Lawyers present their arguments with great passion. The accused stands before the court silent and unrepentant. The accused is not a man or a woman, but a pig. This scene sounds like a bizarre theatrical play. For a long time, historians considered stories of animal trials to be folklore. They seemed too absurd to be real, a tall tale told by monks with a strange sense of humor. But this was no myth. Across medieval Europe, animals were regularly subjected to formal legal proceedings. We know this not from legends, but from actual court records that have survived for centuries. These are not metaphorical accounts. They are detailed legal documents written on parchment. They list charges, witnesses, and verdicts. Pigs, rats, weevils, and even dolphins were arrested. They were held in prison, assigned lawyers, and given a public trial, just like human defendants. This practice stemmed from a unique medieval worldview. In their minds, all of creation fell under the umbrella of God's law. Justice was not just a human concept, it was a cosmic force that maintained balance in the world. If an animal committed a crime, it had disrupted that moral order. Therefore, it had to face the legal consequences. It was a logical extension of a belief system where the sacred and the secular were deeply intertwined. An animal could be seen as a vessel for evil or simply an offender against the community. One of the most famous cases is that of a pig from Falaise, France, in 1386. The animal was accused of mauling a child's face, an act which led to the child's death. The pig was arrested and imprisoned in the local castle. It was given a full trial, complete with a defense attorney who argued on its behalf. The court, however, found the evidence overwhelming. The pig was found guilty of murder. This was not just a simple verdict, it was a formal legal judgment. The sentence was as strange as the trial itself. The guilty pig was sentenced to be mutilated in its head and forelegs. Then it was to be hanged in the public square. To complete the spectacle, the animal was dressed in human clothing, a man's waistcoat and breeches. This was done to emphasize its human-like crime. The public execution served as a solemn warning to both humans and perhaps other animals about the consequences of breaking the law. The town paid for the executioner's services and recorded the expense. The legal system did not stop with large animals. Entire swarms of insects could also be put on trial. In one case, from the 15th century, villagers sued a group of rats for destroying their barley crop. The court appointed a lawyer to represent the rats. In another instance, a plague of locusts was formally charged with trespassing and destruction of property. These pests were not simply exterminated. They were first given their day in court. This process showed respect for the law above all else. These cases involving pests were usually handled by ecclesiastical or church courts. A court official would go to the afflicted fields and read out a summons. The insects were ordered to appear before the judge on a specific date. When the pests inevitably failed to show up, the trial proceeded without them. The church court would often issue a decree. It ordered the creatures to depart the area under threat of a curse or excommunication. The process was more important than the outcome. This strange chapter of legal history reveals a world profoundly different from our own. It shows a deep human need to impose order and meaning on a chaotic world. To the medieval mind, justice was a universal principle. It applied to every creature under God's heaven. The trials were not a sign of foolishness. They were a sign of a society that took its moral framework with absolute seriousness, even when the defendant had 4 legs or 1,000 tiny wings. For generations, the story of America's discovery was simple. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. His voyage opened up a new world to European explorers. He was celebrated as the intrepid navigator who connected to hemispheres. This narrative is etched into our collective memory. It is a foundational story of the modern age. But for centuries, a different tale was told in the cold lands of the north. It was a story whispered in Norse sagas. It was a myth of Viking longships reaching a strange new continent long before Columbus. These stories were found in two Icelandic texts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. They spoke of a land west of Greenland discovered by accident, a place they called Vinland, or the land of wine, because of the wild grapes that grew there. For a long time, scholars treated these sagas as heroic fiction. They were exciting adventures filled with brave explorers and dramatic encounters. But they were considered literature, not history. The idea of Vikings in America seemed as fanciful as their tales of trolls and giants. The hero of this legendary voyage was Leif Erikson. He was the son of Eric the Red, who had established the Norse colony in Greenland. Around the year 1000, the sagas tell us Leif set sail to explore lands sighted by another sailor. He and his crew journeyed across the stormy Atlantic. They discovered a series of new territories. They named them Helgeland, land of flat stones, Markland, land of forests, and finally, the temperate and fertile Vinland. The sagas described a land of promise, a place with timber, salmon, and resources unknown in Greenland. For nearly 1,000 years, this story remained just a story. There was no physical evidence to support the sagas. No Viking helmets or longships had ever been found on American soil. Historians debated endlessly. Was Vinland a real place? Or was it a mythical paradise, a sailor's dream of a better world? Without archaeology, the Viking claim to discovery was relegated to the realm of myth. It was a fascinating possibility, but it could not be proven. The legend seemed destined to remain a footnote in history. Everything changed in the 1960s. A pair of Norwegian archaeologists, Helge and Anstein Ingstead, followed clues from the sagas. They were searching the rugged coastline of North America. At a place called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, they made a stunning discovery. On a grassy terrace overlooking the sea, they found the faint outlines of ancient buildings. They began to excavate. They soon realized they had found something extraordinary. It was something that would rewrite the history of exploration. The Ingstads unearthed the remains of several Norse-style buildings. They were longhouses built of turf and wood. Their construction was identical to Viking settlements in Greenland and Iceland. More importantly, they discovered a forge. Inside was a stone anvil and remnants of smelted iron. They even found iron nails and rivets. This was the smoking gun. The indigenous people of the region did not practice iron smelting. This settlement could only have been built by the Norse. The site at L'Anse aux Meadows was not a large colony. It was a small but functional outpost. It likely served as a base camp or a winter settlement for Viking expeditions. Here they could repair their ships, gather timber, and explore deeper into the new land. The sagas also mention tense and often violent interactions with the native inhabitants. The Vikings called them splings. These conflicts may be one reason the settlement was abandoned after only a few years. Life on this new frontier was difficult and dangerous. The discovery at L'Anse aux Meadows was definitive proof the Old Norse myths were true. Vikings had indeed crossed the Atlantic and built a settlement in North America. They arrived almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Leif Erikson was not a fictional hero, but a real explorer. The sagas were not just legends, but oral histories passed down through generations. The myth of Vinland was a memory of a real place. A chapter of history once dismissed as folklore was finally confirmed as fact. Let us now journey to the misty peat bogs of northern Europe. For centuries, these desolate landscapes in Ireland, Denmark, and Germany were places of superstition. Local folklore described them as haunted ground. They were places where spirits wandered and the veil between worlds was thin. People told stories of travelers who vanished into the marsh without a trace. These tales were seen as cautionary warnings. They were the superstitions of rural folk meant to explain the dangers of the treacherous terrain. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, peat cutters made shocking discoveries. As they sliced into the dense layers of peat, they would occasionally uncover human bodies. These were not skeletons. The bodies were astonishingly well preserved. They had leathery skin, intact hair, and fingernails. Some even had the remnants of their last meal preserved in their stomachs. The expressions on their faces were often frozen in time serene or filled with terror. It was a deeply unsettling sight. Initially, these finds were treated as modern criminal cases. When a body was found, the local police were called to investigate a recent murder. The state of preservation was so perfect it seemed impossible for the bodies to be old. In 1950, when Tolland Man was discovered in Denmark, his face was so peaceful he looked like he was merely sleeping. The authorities believed he was a victim of a crime committed just a few years prior. The investigation began with the assumption of a modern tragedy, but science soon revealed a much older and stranger story. Using radiocarbon dating and forensic analysis, researchers uncovered the truth. These were not recent murder victims. They were ancient people from the Iron Age and the Roman period. Some had been in the bog for over 2,000 years. The unique chemistry of the peat bogs was responsible for their preservation. The cold, acidic water was low in oxygen. This created an environment that tanned the skin and preserved soft tissues like a natural form of mummification. The case of Tolland Man is one of the most famous. Though his body was ancient, his face was the most well-preserved from that era. You could see the wrinkles on his forehead and the stubble on his chin. He wore a pointed skin cap and a hide belt. His peaceful expression, however, hid a violent end. Around his neck was a perfectly preserved braided leather noose. It was pulled tight. He had been hanged or strangled before being placed carefully in the bog. This discovery was not an isolated incident. Many other bog bodies show clear evidence of a violent death. Lindo Man found in England had a slit throat, a fractured skull, and a cord around his neck. The Grobel Man from Denmark had his throat cut from ear to ear. This pattern of extreme violence pointed to a chilling conclusion. These were not accidental deaths or typical murders. The evidence strongly suggested they were victims of ritual human sacrifice. This is where the ancient myth and the modern science connect. The old folklore spoke of the bogs as powerful and hungry places, places where offerings were made to appease ancient gods or nature spirits. The discovery of these ritually killed bodies proved that these legends were not mere fantasy. They were the faint echoes of a dark cultural memory. The bogs were indeed sacred altars where human lives were given as offerings to the gods. These bog bodies provide a hauntingly personal window into a distant past. They are not just archaeological artifacts. They are the faces of ancient people. They stare back at us across millennia. They remind us that the line between myth and reality is often blurred. The legends of sacrifice in the misty bogs were not just stories. They were a chilling and verifiable truth written in the bodies of the dead. In the history of the Middle Ages, few names inspire as much mystery as the assassins. We imagine them as shadowy figures, cloaked in black. They are masters of disguise and silent killing. Their leader is the enigmatic old man of the mountain. He commands them from a secret fortress hidden deep in the Persian mountains. This image has fascinated the West for centuries. It feels like a story crafted for fiction, a legend of a perfect secret society of killers. The most famous tales of the assassins come from the Venetian explorer Marco Polo. He wrote of a mysterious leader who controlled his followers through a powerful trick. He built a secret garden of paradise within his fortress of Alamet. This garden was filled with fountains, wine, and beautiful maidens. Young recruits were drugged. They were carried into the garden and told they were in heaven. After a brief stay, they were removed. The old man promised they could return forever, but only if they died in his service. For centuries, this story was largely believed. It was a compelling explanation for the fanatical devotion of the assassin agents. But the reality is more complex and far more interesting. The assassins were not a simple guild of killers. They were a religious and political movement. They belonged to a branch of Shia Islam known as the Nizari Ismailis. Their real leader was Hassan Sabah, a brilliant scholar and strategist. He was not a sorcerer, but a revolutionary who sought to create a safe haven for his people. His headquarters, Alamat, was a real place. Its name means the eagle's nest. It was a formidable fortress perched on a narrow mountain ridge in modern-day Iran. From this base, Hassan Sabah established a small but resilient Nizari state. Alamat was more than just a military base. It housed a famous library. It attracted scholars and scientists from across the Muslim world. It was a center of learning and resistance against the powerful Seljuk Empire that surrounded them. The agents of Alamet were known as the Fidai. This means those who are willing to sacrifice themselves. They were not brainwashed followers controlled by drugs. They were highly trained and deeply devout individuals. They spent years studying languages and cultures. They were masters of infiltration, able to blend in at the highest levels of enemy courts. Their loyalty came from genuine religious conviction, not from a false promise of paradise. They believed their missions served a divine purpose. Unable to match their enemies in open battle, the Nizari state perfected a different tactic. They used precise, targeted assassination. Their targets were carefully chosen for maximum political impact. They killed powerful viziers, caliphs, and crusader leaders. The Fidai often carried out their missions in public places, like mosques or crowded marketplaces. They rarely tried to escape. Their self-sacrifice was part of the weapon. It created a powerful psychological terror that armies could not match. Modern historical research has debunked the wildest parts of the legend. There is no archaeological or textual evidence for Marco Polo's Paradise Garden. The story that their name comes from the word hashish is also highly debated. It was likely a derogatory term used by their enemies to discredit them. The tales of a drug-fueled cult were probably propaganda. They were stories designed to demonize a group that terrified the established powers of the day. So the myth of a magical garden of delights was false. But the core of the legend was absolutely true. There really was a secretive order of devoted agents. They operated from an impregnable mountain fortress, and they used political assassination as their primary weapon with devastating effect. The reality of the Nazari Ismailis of Alamat is a story of faith, politics, and survival. It is a story even more compelling than the myths that have long shadowed their name. Imagine yourself on a Viking longship in the middle of the North Atlantic. A thick gray fog surrounds you. The sky is a blanket of cloud. The sun is completely hidden from view. You have no magnetic compass, no modern instruments. How do you find your way? How do you navigate the vast and empty ocean? For centuries, this question puzzled historians. The Vikings were master seafarers who colonized Iceland, Greenland, and even reached America. Their navigational skills were legendary, but the secret to their accuracy remained a mystery. An intriguing clue lay hidden within the ancient Norse sagas. In one story about the Norwegian king Olaf, a magical-sounding object is mentioned. It is called a sunstone. In the saga, the king uses this stone on a snowy, overcast day. He holds it up to the sky, and it reveals the exact position of the hidden sun. This allowed his sailors to take their bearings and stay on course. For a long time, this sunstone was dismissed as pure fantasy. It was a magical element in a heroic tale, not a real navigational tool. For hundreds of years, no physical evidence of a sunstone was ever found. Archaeologists excavated Viking ships, graves, and settlements. They found swords, jewelry, tools, and coins. But they never found a crystal labeled as a sunstone. The object seemed to exist only in the pages of legend. Scholars assumed it was either a poetic metaphor or a fictional device. The idea of a magic stone that could find the sun seemed to belong to the world of myth, not the practical world of sailing. Then, in the 20th century, science began to catch up with the legend. Researchers proposed a fascinating theory. The sunstone might have been a specific type of crystal that has a unique property. They identified Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite, as a likely candidate. This type of crystal is naturally polarizing. This means it splits light rays in a very particular way. It was a remarkable hypothesis. A simple stone found in nature could hold the key to the Viking navigation mystery. The science behind the sunstone is both simple and brilliant. Sunlight becomes polarized as it travels through the atmosphere. While our eyes cannot see this polarization, some crystals can detect it. If you hold a piece of Iceland spar up to the sky and rotate it, you will see two overlapping images through it. At one specific angle, the two images become equally bright. That angle points directly towards the sun's position. Even if the sun is hidden by clouds or has just dipped below the horizon. For a long time, this was just a compelling theory. But in 2002, archaeologists found a crucial piece of evidence. They were excavating a 16th century English shipwreck. Aboard the ship, they found a single rhombus-shaped crystal of Iceland spar. It was discovered near the ship's other navigational instruments. While the ship was not from the Viking era, the discovery proved a vital point. It showed that these crystals were indeed kept on board ships and were used for navigation long ago. This discovery transformed the sunstone from myth into a plausible reality. The object described in the saga of King Olaf was no longer a magical fantasy. It was a real and highly effective piece of technology. We now know that the Vikings had the means to create such a tool. They had access to Iceland spar from sources in Iceland. The legendary sunstone was almost certainly a real instrument. It was a vital part of their navigational toolkit. This story reveals the incredible ingenuity of the Norse people. they were not just brutal raiders. They were keen observers of the natural world. They were brilliant innovators who learned to read the sky, the sea, and even the light itself. The sunstone is a perfect example of their resourcefulness. It is a testament to how they mastered the unforgiving oceans of the north. The myth of a magic stone was a memory of lost science, a science we have only recently rediscovered. Let us step into the quiet world of a medieval monastery garden. An old monk tends to his herbs. He is not just a gardener, he is a healer. His pharmacy is the earth itself. He operates on a principle that seems bizarre to modern minds. It is called the doctrine of signatures. The core belief was simple. God had left clues in nature. A plant's appearance revealed which human ailment it was meant to cure. A plant shaped like a heart was for the heart. A root shaped like a tooth was for a toothache. This idea was not just folk magic. It was a widespread medical philosophy in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It was rooted in a deep sense of theological order. Proponents believed that a merciful creator would not leave humanity to suffer without providing remedies. He had designed the world with a hidden code. The signatures were divine instructions. It was the duty of healers and herbalists to learn to read these clues. They saw the world as a living map of cures waiting to be discovered. The examples of this doctrine are wonderfully strange and poetic. Walnuts, with their wrinkled shells, look remarkably like a human brain. Therefore, they were used to treat head injuries, memory loss, and other mental afflictions. The delicate, eye-bright flower has small stripes that resemble bloodshot eyes. It became a popular remedy for all manner of eye infections. Lungwort is a plant with spotted leaves. These spots were thought to resemble diseased lungs, so it was used to treat coughs and respiratory illnesses. For centuries, this entire system was dismissed by modern science. It was seen as the perfect example of superstition. It was magical thinking with no basis in reality. Medicine is built on chemistry and biology, not on visual puns. The doctrine of signatures was considered a quaint but dangerous myth. It was a historical curiosity, a dead end on the road to scientific medicine. How could the shape of a leaf possibly have a connection to complex human anatomy? But here is the fascinating twist. While the medieval reasoning was completely wrong, some of their conclusions were accidentally correct. Modern science has analyzed many of the plants used under the doctrine of signatures. It has found that some of them do contain active chemical compounds. These compounds have real therapeutic effects. In some cases, the effects align perfectly with their traditional uses. The myth was not entirely a myth after all. Let's look at the walnut again. It was used for the brain. We now know that walnuts are one of the richest plant-based sources of omega-3 fatty acids. These are essential nutrients for brain health and function. Willow bark, which is long and flexible like a human limb, was used for joint pain. We now know willow bark contains salicin. This is the natural compound from which aspirin was synthesized. The results were real, even if the theory was not. So how did they get it right? It was likely not divine intervention. It was probably the result of centuries of careful observation. Generations of healers used trial and error. They discovered that certain plants had certain effects. The doctrine of signatures was then used as a framework to explain and remember this knowledge. The theory did not lead to the discovery. The discovery was simply categorized by the theory. It was a memory tool for existing folk medicine. The doctrine of signatures is a powerful reminder. It shows that ancient knowledge should not be dismissed too quickly. Medieval healers were not ignorant fools. They were close observers of the world around them. Their methods were unscientific. Their theories were based on faith, but sometimes their strange and winding path led them to a verifiable truth. The myth held a kernel of reality, a signature of its own pointing to the hidden wisdom of the past. Few legends from the Middle Ages are as scandalous as the story of Pope Joan. The tale describes a woman who disguised herself as a man. She rose through the highest ranks of the Catholic Church. She was eventually elected pope. For centuries, this story was whispered with a mix of shock and fascination. It was the ultimate medieval secret, a woman on the throne of St. Peter. For a long time, modern historians dismissed it as pure fiction. It was an anti-papal myth created to slander the Church. But the truth might be more complicated. The traditional story is a remarkable one. It tells of a brilliant young woman born in Germany around the 9th century. Desperate for an education which was denied to women, she disguised herself as a boy. She entered a monastery under a man's name. Her intellect was so profound that she quickly outshone her peers. She traveled to Rome, where her learning and piety earned her great respect. She rose steadily through the church hierarchy, from scribe to cardinal. No one ever suspected her true identity. Her rise culminated in her unanimous election as pope, following the death of Pope Leo IV. She reigned for more than 2 years as Pope John VIII. She was known for her wisdom and leadership. Her secret was safe until she began an affair with a trusted attendant and became pregnant. The dramatic end to her story came during a public procession through the streets of Rome. In the middle of the crowded parade, she suddenly collapsed. She went into labor and gave birth, revealing her secret to the world. For over 500 years, this story was widely accepted as historical fact. Pope Joan was not a myth. She was a recognized figure in history. Her name appeared in official papal chronicles and lists of popes. Busts depicting her were placed in Sienna's cathedral alongside the other pontiffs. During the late Middle Ages, her story was common knowledge. It was told not just by enemies of the Church, but by respected Dominican and Franciscan scholars. It was a cautionary tale about sin and deception. Then, during the Protestant Reformation, the story came under intense attack. Catholic historians began a campaign to erase Pope Joan from history. They argued that there were no contemporary accounts of her from the 9th century. The first written versions only appeared hundreds of years later. They pointed out that the papal timeline had no room for her reign. The story was officially declared a malicious fable, a piece of propaganda designed to undermine the authority of the papacy. However, in recent years, some historians have begun to re-examine the evidence. They suggest that the story should not be dismissed so quickly. They point to intriguing clues and historical oddities. For instance, there are suspicious gaps and inconsistencies in the papal records for that period. It is possible that documents were altered or destroyed to erase an inconvenient truth. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. One of the strangest pieces of evidence is a peculiar papal ritual. For centuries, new popes were enthroned on a special chair known as the Sella Stercoraria. This throne had a keyhole-shaped opening in the seat. The legend says this chair was used to perform a physical check. It was to ensure that the new pope was indeed a man, a direct response to the Pope Joan scandal. While many scholars dismiss this as symbolic, its existence and the stories surrounding it are hard to ignore. The final verdict on Pope Joan remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. There is no definitive proof that she existed, but there is also no definitive proof that she did not. The legend is no longer seen as a simple myth. It is a complex historical puzzle. The tale of a female pope, once confidently debunked, now lingers as a tantalizing possibility. It shows us that history is never truly settled. The past is a story that we are constantly retelling and revaluing. Let us travel back to 9th century England. An Anglo-Saxon monk dips his quill in ink. He writes with a trembling hand in a book we now call the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. He describes the arrival of a Viking fleet in the year 865. But this is not a typical raiding party. He calls it the Missile Hyen here, the great heathen army. He describes a force of unprecedented size, a horde of warriors that swarmed over the land. It sounded like an apocalyptic event, a plague of men from the sea. For many centuries, historians approached this account with skepticism. It was a well-known fact that medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers. They wrote to create drama, not to provide precise military statistics. Describing an enemy as a massive swarm made a victory seem more heroic. It made a defeat seem more tragic. The idea of a single Viking army, numbering in the many thousands, seemed logistically improbable. It was likely a myth, a scary story told by monks to emphasize their suffering. Yet the actions of this army suggested it was something different. This was not a force that simply looted a monastery and left. This was an army of conquest. Over the next decade, it systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only the southern kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great, managed to resist. The army used England's rivers as highways. They moved their longships deep inland, establishing fortified camps for the winter. Despite these accounts, there was little hard evidence for a massive army. Archaeologists found Viking graves in England, but they were usually small, scattered burials. No giant battlefield or campsite had been found. For a long time, the great heathen army remained a phantom. It was a powerful force in the historical narrative, but it left few traces on the landscape. The legend of a vast Viking horde was compelling, but it lacked the solid proof needed to be accepted as fact. That all changed with recent archaeological discoveries. At a site called Torksey in Lincolnshire, researchers uncovered the remains of a massive Viking winter camp. The camp dated to the exact time the great heathen army was in the area, and it was enormous, covering more than 130 acres. This was not the temporary camp of a few hundred raiders. This was the sprawling, seasonal home of a very large and well-organized force. The evidence unearthed at Torksey and another camp at Repton was staggering. Archaeologists have found thousands of artifacts. These include Arab silver coins, gaming pieces, and metal weights used for trade. This suggests the army was not just made of warriors. It included merchants, craftsmen, and likely their families. At Repton, a mass grave containing the bones of at least 264 people was discovered. It is believed to be the final resting place for a part of the army. This new evidence proves that the medieval monks were not exaggerating. The great heathen army was real, and it was indeed great in number. Estimates, based on the size of the camps, suggest a force of several thousand people. The archaeology confirmed the scale of the invasion described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The myth of a single, overwhelming force was a historical reality, a reality that had remained hidden just beneath the soil for over 1,000 years. This discovery has reshaped our understanding of the Viking Age. It shows that the era was not just about sporadic raids. It involved organized, large-scale invasions and colonization. The terrified monk writing his chronicle was recording the simple truth. A massive force had arrived to conquer his world. The mythical heathen horde was not a product of fear and fantasy. It was a real army that changed the course of English history forever. Let us journey back to the world of Greek mythology. Imagine a vast and devious maze, an impossible network of winding corridors. At its heart lives a terrifying creature, the Minotaur, a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull. This is the labyrinth of King Minos on the island of Crete. The legend says it was built by the master craftsman Daedalus. It was so complex that once inside, no one could ever escape. Every year, young Athenians were sent into its depths as a human sacrifice. For thousands of years, this story was considered pure myth. The labyrinth was a powerful symbol in Greek culture. It represented an inescapable trap, a journey into darkness. The Minotaur was a classic monster from a heroic age. No serious historian or archaeologist believed that such a place literally existed. It was a fictional setting for the hero Theseus to prove his courage. It was a powerful story, but it was just a story, a relic from the dawn of Western imagination. At the beginning of the 20th century, this began to change. An English archaeologist named Sir Arthur Evans was obsessed with a different legend. He was searching for the lost civilization of the Minoans. This was the powerful seafaring kingdom of King Minos, mentioned in Homer's epics. Evans was convinced that Crete held the secrets of this forgotten world. In 1900, he began to dig at a large hill near the island's coast. He was not looking for a myth. He was looking for a palace. What he found exceeded his wildest dreams. He and his team unearthed the ruins of a colossal building. It was a structure of breathtaking size and complexity. It was not a single palace, but a sprawling complex of rooms, workshops, and courtyards. He had discovered the great palace of Knossos, the political and religious center of the entire Minoan civilization. The scale of the discovery was immense. He had brought a lost world back into the light. As the excavation continued, a startling possibility emerged. The layout of Knossos was incredibly confusing. It had over 1,000 rooms connected by twisting corridors and staircases. The floor plan was not symmetrical or logical. It seemed to grow organically over centuries. It had multiple levels with light wells and deep storage cellars. It would have been exceptionally easy to get lost in its maze-like passages. It was a real-world labyrinth. Evans and later historians made a powerful connection. This incredibly complex palace was almost certainly the historical basis for the labyrinth myth. Later Greeks visiting the ancient ruins could easily have described it as a giant maze. The very word labyrinth might be connected to the labyrinth. This was the Minoan symbol of a double-headed axe, which was carved into the palace walls everywhere. The Palace of Knossos was the house of the double axe, and therefore the labyrinth. The connection to the Minotaur was also there. Bull imagery was central to Minoan culture. The palace walls were covered in frescoes of bulls. The most famous of these paintings show a dangerous ritual. Young men and women are depicted athletically, leaping over the backs of charging bulls. This real and deadly ceremony could have been the seed of the myth. Over centuries, the story of youths facing a sacred bull could have transformed into a tale of human sacrifice to a bull monster. So while we have found no bones of a literal minotaur, the myth of the labyrinth was proven to be rooted in a real place. The legend was not a complete invention. It was a distorted cultural memory of the magnificent and confusing palace of Knossos. It was a story told by a later civilization trying to make sense of the awe-inspiring ruins left behind by their predecessors. The discovery of Knossos showed that behind one of the ancient world's greatest myths was an equally incredible historical truth. We now turn our gaze to one of the most baffling objects to survive the Middle Ages. It is a book known as the Voynich manuscript. Its pages are filled with an elegant but completely unreadable script. The text is accompanied by hundreds of colorful illustrations. These drawings are as strange as the writing. They show bizarre plants that do not exist on Earth. They depict astronomical charts of unknown constellations, and they show small, naked figures bathing in interconnected tubes filled with green fluid. For a long time, the most popular theory about this book was simple. It was a clever and elaborate hoax. Many experts believed the manuscript was a fake created sometime in the 16th century or even later. The idea was that an alchemist or a clever con artist had manufactured it. The text was meaningless gibberish. The strange drawings were pure fantasy. It was all designed to fool a wealthy collector into buying a supposedly ancient book of secrets. It was a myth of a myth. This theory was fueled by a century of failure. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, a book dealer, who rediscovered it in 1912. Since then, the world's greatest minds have tried to decipher its secrets. Cryptographers who broke complex military codes were completely stumped. Linguists who could resurrect dead languages found no patterns they recognized. This consistent failure to find any meaning seemed to support the hoax theory. If no one could read it, then perhaps there was nothing to read. Then modern science provided a definitive answer to at least one part of the mystery. Researchers were finally given permission to take a small sample from one of its pages. The parchment made from animal skin was subjected to rigorous radiocarbon dating. The results were announced in 2009 and they were stunning. The test proved the manuscript was no modern forgery. It was not a product of the Renaissance or a later period. The evidence was conclusive. The vellum of the Voynich manuscript was dated to the early 15th century. It was created sometime between the years 1404 and 1438. Further analysis of the inks and paints showed they were consistent with materials commonly used in the Middle Ages. The myth of the book being a clever fake was shattered. It was an authentic artifact from the medieval world. It was a genuine 500-year-old. It was a genuine 500-year-old enigma. This discovery still left a crucial question. Is the writing itself real? The book could be genuinely old, but the text could still be meaningless scribbles. However, sophisticated computer analysis of the script has revealed intriguing patterns. The text follows linguistic rules. For example, it adheres to something called Zipf's law. This law describes the frequency of words in any natural language. The structure and patterns in the Voynich script are not random. They behave like a real language. This suggests the manuscript is not gibberish. It is likely written in either a lost language or an incredibly complex cipher that has yet to be broken. The book is not a prank. It is a genuine repository of some kind of lost knowledge. The strange plants might be extinct species. The astronomical charts could represent an unknown system of cosmology. The bizarre bathing scenes might depict a unique theory of health or medicine. Science has successfully proven that the Voynich manuscript is a real medieval book. The long-held myth that it was an elaborate hoax is false. But in solving one mystery, science has made the central puzzle even deeper. We now know the book is authentic, but we still have no idea what it says or who wrote it. The manuscript is a true artifact from a lost world. It is a silent whisper from the past, a code we have yet to crack. Let us now visit a medieval battlefield. On one side stands the flower of French chivalry. Thousands of heavily armored knights sit astride powerful war horses. They are the most feared fighting force in Europe. Their steel armor gleams in the sun. On the other side stands a citizen's militia from the towns of Flanders. They are weavers, farmers, and craftsmen. They have little armor and are armed with simple long pikes. This looks like a battle that will be over in a single charge. It looks like a slaughter. This was the scene in the year 1302. The wealthy county of Flanders, which is part of modern Belgium, was in open rebellion against the French king. The French king Philip IV sent an elite army of knights to crush the uprising. He expected an easy victory. The Flemish militia met this powerful force on a field near the city of Kortrijk. The stage was set for a classic medieval showdown between noble warriors and common peasants. The outcome seemed certain. The legend that grew from this day is a tale of incredible defiance. The French knights, confident in their superiority, launched a massive cavalry charge. They expected to shatter the Flemish lines and ride down the commoners. But the Flemish pikemen did not break. They stood firm, creating a dense forest of sharpened steel points. According to the story, the knights charged into this wall of pikes and were utterly destroyed. It was a victory of the common man against the noble elite. For a long time, many historians viewed this story as a nationalistic myth. It was a David and Goliath tale. It was a powerful, founding story for Flemish identity. The idea that a peasant army could so decisively defeat noble knights seemed to break all the rules of medieval warfare. The chronicles were likely exaggerated. The victory was probably due to a lucky fluke, not the heroic stand of a citizen army. It was a romantic story, but perhaps not a realistic one. But the core of the legend was absolutely true. The Flemish did not win through luck alone. They won through brilliant tactical planning. They chose their battlefield with extreme care. The field was not the open plain it appeared to be. It was a marshy piece of land crisscrossed by numerous hidden streams and muddy ditches. This terrain was a perfect trap for a heavy cavalry charge. It was a secret weapon hiding in plain sight. The French charge was a disaster, blinded by arrogance and a desire for glory. The knights galloped forward at full speed. Their powerful horses lost their footing in the soft, wet ground. They stumbled into the hidden ditches, breaking the charge's momentum. Knights were thrown from their saddles. They were trapped in the mud, weighed down by their own heavy armor. Their greatest strength, their horses and armor, had become their greatest weakness. With the French knights immobilized and in chaos, the Flemish pikemen advanced. They moved in disciplined ranks and methodically killed the trapped and helpless nobles. The victory was total and shocking. In the aftermath, the Flemish soldiers collected hundreds of golden spurs from the bodies of the slain French knights. These spurs were the symbol of their rank. They were hung as trophies in a nearby church, giving the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Historical analysis and archaeology have since confirmed the details of the battle. The terrain was indeed the decisive factor. The Flemish militia used their knowledge of the local landscape to neutralize the power of the French cavalry. The myth of commoners defeating knights was not a myth at all. It was a real and stunning upset. It was a battle that sent shockwaves across Europe. It proved that a well-organized infantry could defeat the mightiest knights if they had courage and chose their ground wisely. Let us now look at a medieval map of the world. These maps were filled with strange wonders and vast unknown territories. In the heart of these mysterious lands, European mapmakers often placed a legendary kingdom. It was the realm of a mighty Christian king known as Prester John. His kingdom was said to be a utopia, a land of incredible wealth and piety, hidden somewhere in the distant east. It was a Christian island in a sea of pagan and Muslim empires. The legend exploded in popularity in the 12th century. A fantastic letter began to circulate throughout the courts of Europe. The letter was supposedly written by Prester John himself. It described his kingdom in lavish detail. He ruled over 72 lesser kings. His land contained a fountain of youth and a river of jewels. Strange beasts, like salamanders that lived in fire, roamed his lands. The letter was a work of pure fantasy, but it arrived at the perfect time. Medieval Christendom felt isolated and under threat. The Crusades in the Holy Land were a difficult and costly struggle. The idea of a powerful Christian ally in the East was an electrifying prospect. If Prester John and his vast armies could be found, they could attack the Muslim empires from the rear. This alliance could be the key to winning the Crusades and securing the fate of Christianity. The myth of Prester John became a beacon of hope. This hope turned a simple myth into a very real quest. The search for Prester John was not just a story. It became a serious goal of European diplomacy and exploration. Popes sent official letters addressed to Prester John, carried by brave friars. Kings dispatched envoys on perilous journeys into the unknown. The quest to find a fictional king became a driving force of real history. The belief in the myth was so strong that it moved men to cross continents. At first, the search focused on Asia. Crusaders had heard stories of Nestorian Christian communities scattered across the East. European travelers, like Marco Polo, journeyed across the vast Mongol Empire. They looked for this Christian king. They found real but small Christian groups. They found no one who matched the incredible description of Prester John. The legend was likely born from exaggerated rumors of these isolated Christian communities in India and Central Asia. When Prester John could not be found in Asia, the search shifted. Europeans began to believe his kingdom must be in Africa. They had heard vague reports of an ancient and powerful Christian kingdom in Ethiopia. For the great Portuguese explorers of the 15th century, finding this kingdom became a primary objective. Prince Henry the Navigator urged his captains to sail down the coast of Africa. They were to find a sea route to the Indies and to make contact with Prester John. After decades of exploration, Portuguese envoys finally reached Ethiopia in the early 16th century. They found what they were looking for, a real and ancient Christian kingdom. It was isolated and surrounded by powerful enemies. It was not the magical paradise from the letter, but it was a Christian realm ruled by a king. For the Portuguese, they had finally found the land of Prester John. The reality was different, but the core discovery was made. In the end, Prester John himself was a myth. No single king ever ruled a magic kingdom in the East, but the quest for him was entirely real. The belief in this legend inspired popes and kings. It fueled 2 centuries of exploration. It pushed Europeans to map the globe and make contact with distant civilizations. The search for a fantasy king had a very real and profound impact on the shaping of the modern world. A myth had changed the course of history. Close your eyes and picture a Viking warrior. The image that comes to mind is almost universal. A large man with a wild beard and a ferocious expression. He wields a heavy axe or a broadsword, and on his head he wears a metal helmet adorned with a large pair of menacing horns. This is the iconic image of the Viking. It is seen in movies, comic books, and on the helmets of football fans. It is the undisputed symbol of the Norseman, a powerful and instantly recognizable look. But this powerful image is a complete myth. It is one of the most persistent historical inaccuracies in popular culture. The truth is that Viking warriors did not wear horned helmets. The entire idea is a much later invention. The myth began not in the fjords of 9th century Norway, but in the opera houses of 19th century Germany. In 1876, the costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for a production of Wagner's epic opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung. The horned helmets were a piece of theatrical flair. They were designed to make the Norse characters on stage look more dramatic and barbaric. The image was so striking that it captured the public's imagination. Artists and illustrators began to copy the style. Soon, the horned helmet became the standard representation of a Viking. The myth was born not from history, but from the stage. No one at the time seemed to ask a simple question. Do horns on a helmet make any practical sense in a battle? The answer is a resounding no. In the chaos of real combat, a horned helmet would be a terrible liability. Horns would provide a perfect handhold for an enemy to grab and twist your head. A powerful blow to a horn could wrench the helmet off or even break the wearer's neck. They would get caught on tree branches during a forest ambush, or they could snag on the rigging of a longship. Real medieval armor was designed for practicality and survival. Horns offered no advantage and created many weaknesses. The archaeological record proves this conclusively. Historians have unearthed numerous helmets from the Viking Age. The most complete example ever found is the German Boo helmet discovered in Norway. It is a simple and brutally effective piece of equipment. It is a rounded iron cap made from several pieces of metal riveted together. It features a distinctive face guard, shaped like a pair of spectacles, and a prominent guard to protect the nose. It is functional and unadorned. So where did the idea of horned helmets come from at all? There is a small grain of truth buried deep in history. Horned or crested helmets did exist in Northern Europe, but they were from a much earlier time. They date back to the Nordic Bronze Age, hundreds of years before the Vikings. These were likely rare and ceremonial items. They were worn by chieftains or priests, not by common warriors in battle. The 19th century artists likely saw these ancient artifacts and incorrectly associated them with the more famous Vikings. So the myth of the horned Viking helmet is just that, a myth. It is a piece of romantic fiction that has proven incredibly difficult to correct. The real Vikings were pragmatic warriors. Their equipment was forged for function, not for fantasy. Their simple, bowl-shaped helmets offered excellent protection without any of the dramatic and dangerous additions. The historical truth is less theatrical, but it reveals a more realistic picture of the past. By debunking this myth, we can finally see the true face of the Viking warrior. He was not a barbarian from an opera. He was a skilled and well-equipped soldier. The simple iron helmet he wore has been proven to be his real headgear. The legend of the horns is false, but the truth of the practical and effective Norse warrior has been confirmed by the artifacts he left behind. The myth is dead, but the real history lives on. Let us now enter the smoky forge of a medieval swordsmith. Here, in the heart of the Middle East, a legendary material was created. It was known as Damascus steel. Swords made from this metal were the stuff of legend. They were carried by the great Saracen warriors. A crusader knight facing a Damascus blade knew he was facing a weapon of superior quality. The stories told of their incredible sharpness. A Damascus sword could supposedly cut through a piece of silk, falling upon its edge. These blades were famed for a unique combination of properties. They were incredibly hard and could hold a razor-sharp edge for a long time. Yet they were also flexible and resilient. They would bend without breaking in the heat of combat. This combination of hardness and toughness was the holy grail of metallurgy. But their most famous characteristic was a beautiful pattern on the surface of the steel. It was a swirling, watery design known as the damask. This distinctive look made the blades as beautiful as they were deadly. Sometime around the year 1750, the secret to making this incredible metal was lost. The specific techniques and raw materials disappeared. Swordsmiths could no longer produce steel with the same qualities or the iconic pattern. Damascus steel became a lost art. Its reputation grew even greater in its absence. It became a mythical substance, a perfect material from a bygone era that modern technology could not replicate. The legend of the invincible blade became frozen in time. For the next 200 years, bladesmiths and scientists tried to rediscover the secret. Many attempts were made to reverse engineer the process. Even the brilliant 19th century scientist Michael Faraday studied Damascus blades. He tried to understand their chemical composition. Everyone failed. They could make strong steel. They could create steel with a surface pattern through a technique called pattern welding. But no one could reproduce the unique properties and internal structure of true Damascus steel. The breakthrough finally came in the modern era. Using powerful scanning electron microscopes, scientists were able to look deep inside the structure of original Damascus swords. What they found was astonishing. The secret of the steel's strength was not visible to the naked eye. It was happening at a microscopic level. The medieval smiths had unknowingly created one of the first man-made The analysis revealed that Damascus steel contained carbon nanotubes. It also had nanowires of a substance called cementite. These are incredibly small and incredibly strong structures. They formed within the steel during the forging process. They reinforced the metal internally. This gave the blades their legendary combination of strength and flexibility. The medieval craftsman had stumbled upon a form of nanotechnology 1,000 years ahead of its time. The process likely began with a special raw material, a type of steel ingot from India known as Wootz steel. This steel was made from an ore that contained trace impurities of elements like vanadium. When the smiths repeatedly heated and hammered the Wootz steel, these impurities helped the carbon atoms to form into the powerful nanostructures. The visible damask pattern on the blade was the large-scale reflection of this hidden microscopic arrangement. So the legends were not a myth. The stories of the incredible properties of Damascus steel were entirely true. Modern science has proven that these blades were indeed a superior form of technology. The medieval smiths of Damascus were masters of their craft. They had perfected a process so complex that it took us centuries and some of our most advanced scientific instruments to finally understand it. A lost art has been rediscovered. A legend has been proven to be fact. Let us now enter the unsettling world of ancient and medieval surgery. Imagine a patient lying down while a healer holds a sharpened flint or a simple metal drill. The healer is not working on an arm or a leg. He is about to deliberately cut a hole into the patient's skull. This is the practice of trepanation. It is one of the oldest and most shocking surgical procedures in human history. To modern ears, it sounds like a form of brutal torture or an assured death sentence. The common assumption is that this procedure was pure barbarism. We imagine it was based on superstition, a crude attempt to release evil spirits trapped inside a person's head. We believe that in a world without modern anesthesia and antibiotics, the survival rate must have been 0. The myth is that trepanation was a terrifying ritual. It was a fatal procedure that highlights the ignorance of pre-modern medicine. It was butchery disguised as a cure. But this was not a rare or isolated ritual. Trepanation was a surprisingly common and widespread medical practice for thousands of years. Trepanned skulls have been discovered all across the globe. They have been found in ancient burial sites in Peru, Europe, and Africa. The procedure was performed consistently from the Stone Age right through the medieval period. This was not a bizarre cultural quirk. It was a standard high-stakes surgical intervention used by many different civilizations. The reasons for performing trepanation were varied. Yes, releasing spirits was likely a motivation in some cultures, but there were also clear medical goals. It was often used to treat physical injuries such as skull fractures from battle. Cutting a hole could relieve dangerous pressure building on the brain. Ancient texts and archaeological evidence also suggest it was used to treat epilepsy, chronic headaches, and other neurological disorders. They were performing brain surgery to cure real-world ailments. The most stunning revelation comes from the skulls themselves. This is where the myth of it being universally fatal is shattered. Archaeologists have found hundreds of trepanned skulls that show clear and unmistakable signs of healing. This is the definitive proof that patients survived the procedure. The evidence is written directly into the bone. This proves the reality of their medical skill. When a hole is cut into the skull of a living person, the bone immediately begins to heal. Over time, the sharp edges of the cut become smooth and rounded as new bone grows. Many ancient skulls show this smooth, rounded edge. In some cases, the amount of regrowth is extensive. This is undeniable evidence that the patient did not die on the operating table. They lived for weeks, months, or even many years after the surgery. This high survival rate tells us something incredible about our ancestors. These early surgeons were not clumsy hacks. They possessed a remarkable degree of skill and knowledge. They understood enough about the skull's anatomy to avoid cutting major arteries or damaging the delicate membranes covering the brain. They likely had access to powerful herbal painkillers and antiseptics to manage pain and prevent infection. Their success was not a fluke. So the story of trepanation is not the simple tale of horror we imagined. The myth of it being a purely spiritual and deadly procedure is false. It was a real and often successful medical operation. The healed skulls of these ancient patients are a silent testament to this fact. They prove a level of surgical sophistication that we have long underestimated. A practice once dismissed as barbaric has been proven to be a story of surprising and ancient medical success. Let us now travel to the edges of the ancient Greek world. Here, in the realm of myth, lived a legendary tribe of warriors. They were the Amazons, a nation made up entirely of women. In Greek art and literature, they are depicted as fierce and beautiful figures. They are masters of the horse and the bow. They were the equals of the greatest male heroes. Figures like Hercules and Achilles tested their might against Amazon queens. The Amazons were a source of both fear and deep fascination for the ancient Greeks. The myths described a society that was the complete opposite of the Greek ideal. In ancient Athens, women lived secluded lives confined to the home. The Amazons, by contrast, lived for battle and the hunt. The legends claimed they rejected men entirely. They would only interact with them to have children. They would then keep the baby girls to raise as new warriors and discard the boys. This story of a powerful, matriarchal society was a potent and enduring fantasy. For thousands of years, the Amazons were considered nothing more than a myth. They were a powerful creation of the Greek imagination. Historians saw them as a symbolic people, not a real one. They represented a world turned upside down, a society where the natural order was reversed. The Amazons were a literary device. They were a way for a male-dominated society to explore its fears and fantasies about female power. They were a legend, not a lost tribe. But one ancient Greek historian provided a tantalizing clue. The writer Herodotus, who is known as the father of history, wrote about the Amazons. He placed them in a real geographical location. He said they lived in the lands of Scythia. This was the vast territory of steppes and grasslands north of the Black Sea. Herodotus claimed the Amazons eventually encountered the Scythians, a real nomadic people famous for their horsemanship. He described a merging of the two peoples. This clue led modern archaeologists to a stunning discovery. For decades, they have been excavating Scythian burial mounds called kurgans in Ukraine and southern Russia. Inside these mounds, they found the graves of many warriors. These individuals were buried with the full honors of a fighter. They had their horses, weapons, and armor laid beside them for the afterlife. For a long time, it was simply assumed that all of these warrior graves belonged to men. Modern science proved that assumption wrong. Using DNA analysis and forensic anthropology, researchers examined the skeletons from these warrior graves. The results were revolutionary. They discovered that a significant number of these Scythian warriors were in fact women. In some burial sites, as many as 1/3 of the warrior graves belonged to females. The evidence was undeniable. Women were being buried with weapons and battle honors, just like the men. These were the real women who inspired the Amazon myths. They were not a mythical, all-female tribe. They were part of the Scythian culture, where some women lived as warriors. Their bones often show signs of battle injuries. They were buried with quivers full of arrows, swords, and daggers. They were clearly not just ceremonial figures. They were active and respected combatants. They were the horse-riding warrior women that Herodotus had described. So the ancient Greek myth of the Amazons was not pure fantasy after all. It was an exaggerated and romanticized account of a real historical phenomenon. The Greeks, who were traders and colonists on the Black Sea coast, likely heard stories about the Scythians. The sight of women riding and fighting alongside men would have been shocking to them. From this kernel of truth, they spun the legend of an entire nation of warrior women. Archaeology has proven that the core of this famous myth was true. We now turn to one of the greatest stories ever told, the tale of the Trojan War. For 10 long years, the armies of Greece laid siege to the mighty city of Troy. It was a war fought over a beautiful queen, Helen. It was a war of legendary heroes like the swift-footed Achilles and the noble Trojan prince, Hector. The story culminates in the famous trick of the Trojan horse. The Greeks pretend to sail away, leaving a giant wooden horse as an offering. The Trojans pull it into their city and seal their doom. For more than 2,000 years, this epic tale was considered a work of fiction. Homer's Iliad was seen as the cornerstone of Western literature, but not as a history book. The city of Troy was a mythical place, a fantasy setting for a grand story. Historians believed the Trojan War was a legend. It was created by poets to explain a dark age in Greece's past. There was no physical evidence that the high walls of Troy had ever actually stood. It was a lost city from a world of myth. This changed because of the obsession of one man. Heinrich Schliemann was a wealthy German businessman. From his childhood, he had been fascinated by Homer's epics. He refused to believe they were pure fantasy. He was convinced that Troy was a real place and that he could find it. He retired from his business. He dedicated his enormous fortune and the rest of his life to this single, ambitious quest. He would prove that the experts were wrong and that Homer told the truth. Schliemann used the Iliad as his guide. He treated the ancient poem like a treasure map. Homer's text contained detailed geographical clues about Troy's location. It described a city near the sea. It mentioned 2 rivers and a large plain suitable for battles. These clues pointed Schliemann to a specific region in northwestern Turkey. He focused his search on a large earthen mound, known locally as his Sarlik. He believed the lost city of Troy lay buried beneath it. In the 1870s, against the advice of many professional scholars, Schliemann began to dig. His methods were often crude and destructive. He carved a massive trench straight through the heart of the mound, but his conviction paid off. He did not find a single city. He found the ruins of at least 9 different cities. They were layered, one on top of the other, like a giant cake of history. Each city had been built on the ruins of the one before. Schliemann believed he had found Homer's Troy in one of the lower layers. He famously unearthed a spectacular hoard of gold jewelry and artifacts. He dramatically named it Priam's treasure, after the legendary king of Troy. He even had his young wife, Sophia, wear the ancient jewelry for a famous photograph. For Schliemann, this was the ultimate proof. He had discovered the world of Homer's heroes. He had brought a myth to life. Later, archaeologists would correct many of Schliemann's conclusions. His methods were criticized. His identification of Priam's treasure was likely wrong, as it came from a layer 1,000 years older than the Trojan War. However, his central claim was correct. More careful modern excavations have confirmed that Hisarlik is indeed the site of ancient Troy, the layer known as Troy. Via is now considered the most likely candidate for the city of the Iliad. This layer shows clear signs of a violent siege and destruction right around 1200 BC. So, the legendary city of Troy was not a myth. Schliemann's obsessive quest proved it was a real place. While the gods and goddesses of the story were fiction, the city was a historical reality. It was a powerful and wealthy Bronze Age citadel, and it was likely destroyed in a great war. One of the world's most famous legends was proven to be rooted in a verifiable historical truth. A city once lost to myth had been rediscovered. Let us now explore one of the most famous legends of all time, the story of the lost city of Atlantis. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato first wrote of this magnificent island civilization. He described Atlantis as a utopian paradise. It was a land of great wealth, technological advancement, and military power. But the people of Atlantis grew arrogant and corrupt. As a punishment from the gods, the island was destroyed in a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods. It sank beneath the waves and vanished forever. For more than 2,000 years, Atlantis was considered a purely fictional place. Most scholars believed Plato had invented the story. It was a philosophical allegory. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the fall of great empires. Atlantis was not a destination on a map. It was a moral lesson. The search for a literal lost continent was seen as a fool's errand. It was a myth meant to teach, not to be discovered. But what if Plato's story was not a complete invention? What if it was based on a real historical event, a real cataclysm that was so devastating it was remembered for centuries? Some researchers began to look for a real-world disaster that could match the description of Atlantis's sudden and violent end. Their search led them to the beautiful Greek island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea. They were not looking for a lost continent, but for a lost catastrophe. Modern geologists know that Santorini is not a typical island. Its famous crescent shape is actually the rim of a massive volcano. The beautiful bay at its center is a flooded caldera. This is the place where the heart of a great mountain exploded and collapsed into the sea. Scientific evidence shows that around 1600 BC, this volcano erupted with almost unimaginable force. It was one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded human history. The proven true part of our story lies beneath the island's soil. In the 1960s, archaeologists began excavating a site called Akrotiri on Santorini. Buried under a deep layer of volcanic ash, they discovered an entire city. It was a remarkably well-preserved Bronze Age settlement, a Minoan city, frozen in time, just like Pompeii. It had paved streets, multi-story buildings, and beautiful frescoes on the walls. This was a real lost city, swallowed by a volcano. The eruption of Thera, as the volcano is known, was a cataclysm of mythical proportions. It was many times more powerful than the famous eruption of Krakatoa. It would have sent a column of ash and gas miles into the sky. This would have blotted out the sun and caused global climate disruption. The collapse of the volcano into the sea would have triggered gigantic tsunamis. These waves would have radiated across the Aegean, wiping out coastal towns. This real disaster happened at the height of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans, based on the nearby island of Crete, were a powerful and advanced seafaring people. The eruption of Thera would have been a devastating blow. Their powerful navy would have been crippled. Their coastal settlements would have been destroyed. The collapse of the Minoan civilization shortly after this period is likely no coincidence. A great civilization was brought to its knees by a natural disaster. So while we have not found Plato's Atlantis, we have found the event that likely inspired it. The legend of a great island civilization suddenly destroyed by the sea is not a complete fantasy. It is very likely a distorted memory of a real historical trauma. The eruption of Thera and the subsequent collapse of the Minoan world. Plato's myth was the philosophical echo of a real catastrophe. A story passed down for 1,000 years until it was woven into a timeless legend. Let us now travel to the misty green hills of medieval Ireland. Imagine an old stone castle on a dark and quiet night. Suddenly, a mournful cry drifts on the wind. It is a high-pitched wail filled with an unbearable sorrow. This is the legendary sound of the banshee. According to Irish folklore, the banshee is a female spirit from the otherworld. Her cry is a terrifying omen. It is never heard without reason. It foretells the imminent death of a member of one of Ireland's great families. The banshee is one of the most famous figures in Celtic mythology. Her appearance in stories varies. Sometimes she is a beautiful young woman with long silver hair. Other times she is a frightening old hag washing a blood-stained cloak in a river. But her most defining feature is her unearthly voice. Her cry is said to be the most sorrowful sound in the world. It is a sound that chills the soul and signals that death is near. For centuries, this story has been told as one of the world's great ghost stories. It is a tale of the supernatural, a superstition born from a fear of death and the unknown. The banshee was a creature of the night, a phantom from a fairy tale. Historians and folklorists viewed her as a purely mythical being. She was a figment of the Celtic imagination, a poetic way to represent the coming of death. But the truth is far more human and just as fascinating. The myth of the banshee is almost certainly born from a very real and once common Irish tradition. This was the practice of keening. In Gaelic Ireland, a keener or bean chowent was a professional mourner. These were women who were hired by families to grieve publicly at funerals and wakes. Their role was a vital and respected part of the grieving process. They were the conductors of the community's sorrow. The art of keening was a dramatic and highly skilled performance. The keening women would lead the mourning with loud wails and cries. They would chant poetic verses praising the life of the deceased. They would recall their great deeds and lament their passing. It was a powerful and emotional ritual. It was designed to help the living express their grief and to honor the dead. This was not quiet weeping. It was a loud and passionate public display of sorrow. The sound of keening was described as piercing and otherworldly. A skilled keener's voice could carry for a great distance across the quiet rural landscape. Imagine you are a traveler, unfamiliar with this custom. You are passing through the Irish countryside at night. You hear these high-pitched, mournful wails echoing from a distant village. It would be an eerie and deeply unsettling experience. It would sound like the cry of something not quite human. Here we see the clear link between the real tradition and the supernatural myth. The keening woman, a real person associated with death, gradually transformed into the banshee, a spirit that foretells death. The sound of a real woman's ritual lament became the sound of a spirit's prophetic cry. The myth was a supernatural explanation for a very real and very human sound. The connection is powerful and direct. So the legend of the wailing banshee is not just a ghost story. It is the folkloric memory of a lost Gaelic tradition. The professional practice of keening has mostly disappeared from modern Ireland, but its spirit lives on in the form of one of the world's most enduring supernatural myths. The terrifying cry of the banshee was once the sound of a real woman's voice, a myth proven to be the ghost of a powerful human custom. Let us journey to the wild and wind-swept coast of eastern England. Here, crumbling cliffs meet the gray waves of the North Sea. For centuries, the people of this area have told a ghostly tale. They speak of a great city that was lost beneath the waves, a city called Dunwich. Local fishermen have long shared stories. They claim their nets would sometimes snag on the sunken steeples of lost churches. On stormy nights, some swore they could hear the faint sound of church bells ringing from under the sea. This story of a sunken city sounds like a classic piece of folklore. It is England's own version of Atlantis, a romantic legend about the awesome power of nature and the impermanence of man. The idea of a major city simply disappearing into the ocean seems too dramatic to be entirely true. The tales of ghostly bells ringing beneath the waves feel like a sailor's yarn, a story told to pass the time on a dark and stormy night. But this is one legend that is completely and verifiably true. Dunwich was not a mythical place. During the early Middle Ages, it was a real and thriving city. In the 12th century, it was one of the largest and wealthiest towns in all of England. It was a major international port, a bustling hub of trade and shipbuilding. Its size and importance rivaled that of London at the time. It was home to a dozen churches, several monasteries, and a powerful naval fleet. The city's doom was sealed by its location. Dunwich was built on soft, sandy soil, right at the edge of the sea. This made it dangerously vulnerable to coastal erosion. Starting in the 13th century, a series of colossal storms began to batter the English coastline. These were not ordinary storms. They were massive events that carried the force of modern hurricanes. They permanently altered the landscape. For the city of Dunwich, this was the beginning of the end. The destruction was not a single sudden event. It was a slow and agonizing death that stretched over several centuries. With each major storm, another piece of the city was devoured by the sea. A great storm in 1286 silted up the town's harbor, crippling its trade. A few decades later, another tempest washed away an entire parish and its monastery. The sea was an unstoppable enemy. The city was in a constant state of retreat. The people of Dunwich fought a desperate and losing battle. They tried to build sea defenses, but the waves smashed them to pieces. Historical records show the town shrinking decade by decade. One by one, its great churches and grand buildings reached the cliff's edge. They would stand for a time as precarious ruins. Then they too would crumble and fall into the churning water below. By the 17th century, the once great city was little more than a tiny village. Today, modern science is proving the old legends true. Marine archaeologists are using advanced sonar equipment to map the seabed off the Dunwich coast. They have found the underwater ruins of the lost city. They have identified the foundations of several of the great churches. They can trace the ghostly outlines of ancient streets and harbor walls. The stories told by the old fishermen were not fantasies. They were memories passed down through generations. The legend of the great city of Dunwich, swallowed by the sea, is not a myth. It is a documented historical and geological fact. As for the ghostly bells, it remains a powerful piece of folklore, but it is a legend that commemorates a very real tragedy. It is a poetic memory of a real city, a city whose ruins now lie scattered on the ocean floor, a silent testament to the relentless power of the sea. Let us now imagine a dramatic scene from the age of chivalry. Two armored knights stand in a roped-off field. A crowd watches in silence as a herald announces the charges. At the signal, the knights lower their visors and charge at each other with lances. This is a trial by combat, a formal duel to the death. The winner will be declared innocent. The loser, if he survives the fight, will be judged guilty and likely executed. God himself is expected to be the final judge. This dramatic spectacle is a famous trope in movies and fantasy novels. It seems almost too theatrical to be a part of a real legal system. We might think of trial by combat as a rare event, something reserved only for kings and high nobles in epic disputes. The myth is that these duels of justice were more of a literary invention than a common reality, a dramatic flourish in a story, but not a routine part of the law. But this was no myth. Trial by combat was a very real and legally sanctioned procedure throughout medieval Europe. It was introduced by the Germanic tribes that came to dominate the continent after the fall of Rome. The Normans, in particular, championed its use in England after their conquest in 1066. It was used to settle serious criminal accusations like murder and treason. It was also used for civil disputes like arguments over land ownership. The logic behind this violent practice was rooted in deep religious faith. The medieval world believed that God was an active and direct participant in human affairs. They believed he would not allow an injustice to stand. A trial by combat was therefore not just a fight between two people. It was seen as a direct appeal to God. It was believed that God would intervene in the battle. He would grant strength to the righteous and cause the liar to fail. Victory was a sign of divine favor and innocence. These duels were not chaotic brawls. They were highly ritualized legal events. The process began with a formal accusation and a denial in court. Both parties would then have to swear solemn oaths on holy relics. They would swear that their cause was just. The combat took place in a special enclosed area called the lists. The fight was overseen by a judge, a lord, or even the king himself. There were strict rules about the types of weapons and armor that could be used. An interesting feature of the system was the use of champions. What happened if the accused was someone who could not fight? A woman, a child, a disabled person, or a member of the clergy could not be expected to duel. In these cases, they were allowed to hire a champion to fight on their behalf. This led to the rise of a strange profession. Professional duelists, men who were experts in combat. They were essentially lawyers who argued their client's case with a sword or an axe. One of the most famous and last legally sanctioned duels in France took place in 1547. It was between two nobles, Guy Chabot de Yarnac and Francois de Vivant. De Yarnac was the underdog, but he won the duel with a surprise hamstring cut to his opponent's leg. This cunning and unexpected move gave rise to the French expression, the blow of Yarnac. It shows that the tradition of judicial combat lasted well into the Renaissance. The practice of trial by combat slowly faded over time. As legal systems grew more sophisticated, they began to rely on evidence, testimony, and juries. The idea of leaving justice to a duel seemed increasingly barbaric and unreliable. But for centuries, it was a real and accepted part of life. The dramatic duels of justice we see in fiction were not just a story. They were a real way. Medieval people sought the truth, trusting that God would ensure the right man won. Let us now enter a smoky cafe in 19th century Paris. An artist sits at a small table. He stares into a glass of a cloudy liquid, that seems to glow with a pale green light. This is absinthe, a drink that was both a muse and a monster. It was nicknamed La Verte, or the Green Fairy. It was the legendary beverage of choice for artists and writers. Men like Van Gogh, Picasso, and Oscar Wilde all fell under its spell. It was said to unlock the gates of creativity. The myths surrounding absinthe's effects were extraordinary. People believed it was far more than just a strong drink. It was considered a powerful psychoactive substance. The legend claimed it could induce vivid hallucinations and strange visions. The Green Fairy would supposedly appear to the drinker, offering inspiration or madness. But this muse had a dark side. Absinthe was blamed for causing delirium psychosis and fits of violent rage. It was a drink that could give you genius or destroy your mind. Part of its mystique came from the elaborate ritual of its preparation. A special slotted spoon was laid across the top of a glass containing a measure of absinthe. A sugar cube was placed on the spoon. Then ice-cold water was dripped slowly from a fountain onto the sugar. As the sweetened water hit the spirit, the clear green liquid would transform. It would turn into a cloudy, opalescent white. This process was called the louche, and it added a sense of theater and magic to every glass. This powerful reputation eventually led to its downfall. A wave of moral panic swept across Europe and America in the early 20th century. Absinthe was branded as a social poison. It was blamed for crime, insanity, and the decay of society. The final blow came from a notorious murder case in Switzerland in 1905. A peasant farmer killed his family after a day of heavy drinking that included absinthe. The public outcry was immense. By 1915, the Green Fairy was banned in most of the Western world. For nearly a century, the myths were all that remained. The drink's legendary effects were believed to come from a chemical called thujan. This compound is found in wormwood, one of absinthe's key herbal ingredients. Thujan was thought to be a powerful hallucinogen. This chemical was the proven true secret behind the Green Fairy's power. It was the scientific explanation for the legends. However, modern science has since re-examined the evidence. Researchers have analyzed surviving bottles of pre-ban absinthe from the 19th century. They discovered that the levels of thujan were actually very low. They were far too low to cause the kind of hallucinations described in the myths. The story of thujan being a powerful psychedelic was largely an exaggeration. The chemical was not the main culprit. The real secret to absinthe's powerful effect was much simpler. It was incredibly strong. Vintage absinthe was often bottled at an extremely high proof. It sometimes contained over 70% alcohol. People were consuming a vast amount of alcohol in a short period. The so-called absinthism, with its madness and addiction, was not a unique disease. It was the tragic and well-known effect of chronic alcoholism. So the legend of the Green Fairy was a complex mix of truth and fear. Absinthe was a real and culturally significant drink. Its ritual was real. Its devastating social impact was real. But the myth of a magical hallucinogen was largely false. The proven true part is that its effects came from its sheer alcoholic strength. The fairy was not a chemical vision. It was the potent and dangerous ghost of alcohol itself, wrapped in a century of romantic and terrifying legends. Let us begin with one of the most famous legends in the world, the story of the sword in the stone. A young boy named Arthur steps forward in a crowded churchyard. He places his hands on the hilt of a sword that is embedded in a great stone. With a single, effortless pull, he draws the blade free. This act proves he is the rightful heir to the throne of Britain. It is a timeless story of destiny, magic, and the birth of a king. For centuries, this tale has been recognized as pure myth. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are figures of legend, not history. The sword in the stone is a powerful symbol. It represents the idea that true leadership is a matter of divine right, not just brute force. It is a beautiful and inspiring piece of fiction, a foundational story of the medieval imagination. It is a fairy tale that no one expects to be literally true. But what if a real sword in the stone actually existed? While King Arthur's sword is a myth, there is an authentic medieval sword that is genuinely plunged into solid rock. To see it, you must travel to the Montecipi Chapel in Tuscany, Italy. Inside this humble, circular building is an incredible and baffling sight. The hilt and a few inches of a blade stick out from a large stone on the floor. It is a physical manifestation of the famous legend. This real sword is tied to the story of a 12th century saint. His name was Galgano Guidotti. He was a wealthy and arrogant knight known for his violent and dissolute lifestyle. One day he had a powerful religious vision. The archangel Michael appeared to him and commanded him to renounce his sinful ways. Galgano declared he would rather split a rock with his sword than give up his worldly pleasures. To prove his point, he struck a nearby stone with his blade. According to the legend, a miracle occurred. Instead of shattering on the rock, the sword slid into it with ease. It went in as if the stone were made of soft butter. Galgano was so moved by this divine sign that he immediately gave up his life as a knight. He became a hermit, living a life of quiet prayer on that very hill. The sword embedded in the stone served as his cross. After his death, he was made a saint. The sword became a holy relic. For many years, people assumed this was a clever forgery, a fake relic created by the church to attract pilgrims and their money. But modern science has revealed a stunning truth. In the early 21st century, researchers were given permission to study the sword. They used metal composition analysis and ground-penetrating radar. They wanted to finally determine if the story was real. The results were astonishing. The scientific analysis confirmed that the sword's style and metal composition were authentic to the 12th century. This is the exact period when Saint Galgano lived. The radar scans also proved that the blade continues deep down into the rock. It is not just a hilt that has been stuck on top. It is a genuine, full-length sword. The science confirmed the physical reality of the object. So while we can never scientifically prove that a miracle happened, we have proven that the object itself is real. The core of the Saint Galgano legend is true. A 12th century knight's sword is indeed embedded in a stone in Tuscany. The famous myth of a sword in the stone, made popular by the tales of King Arthur, has a real and historically verified counterpart. It is a tangible piece of a legend, a myth that you can actually see and touch, proven true by science. Let us now explore one of the strangest beliefs from the natural history of the Middle Ages. Imagine a tree growing on the edge of the sea. Hanging from its branches are strange, shell-like pods. As these pods mature, they crack open. From inside emerges not a fruit or a seed, but a tiny living goose. The small bird then drops into the water below and swims away. This was the legend of the goose tree, a story that seems utterly absurd to our modern minds. This bizarre idea was born from a genuine natural mystery. Every winter, a particular species of goose would arrive in large numbers in places like Ireland, Britain, and Scotland. We now call this bird the barnacle goose, but for medieval Europeans, these geese were a complete puzzle. No one had ever seen them build a nest. No one had ever found one of their eggs. No one had ever seen their young goslings. The birds just seemed to materialize out of thin air each autumn. To explain this mystery, medieval observers created an ingenious theory. They saw that pieces of driftwood in the sea were often covered in a specific type of crustacean. This creature is called the goose barnacle. It has a long stalk and a white shell. From the shell protrude feathery appendages used for feeding. To the medieval eye, these feathery parts looked like the downy feathers of a tiny bird. They made a connection. The geese must be spontaneously generating from these barnacles. This was not just a simple folk tale. For several centuries, it was considered a scientific fact. Respected scholars and naturalists of the day wrote about it with complete sincerity. The 12th century writer, Gerald of Wales, described the process in detail in his book on the topography of Ireland. He claimed to have seen it with his own eyes. The goose tree was presented as one of the great wonders of God's creation, a marvel of the natural world. This strange belief had a very convenient side effect. The medieval church had strict rules about fasting. Christians were forbidden from eating meat on Fridays and during the holy season of Lent. However, fish was permitted. Since these barnacle geese were not born of flesh from an egg, they were classified as fish. This meant they could be legally eaten during times of fasting. This religious loophole made the story of the goose tree very popular and useful. Of course, the barnacle goose is a very real bird. The medieval people were not imagining it. They were excellent observers of the animal itself. They accurately described its appearance and its seasonal arrival. The proven true part of this story is the goose. It exists, and it does exactly what they said it did. It appears in the winter and disappears in the spring. Their observation was correct. Their explanation was simply wrong. The real answer to the mystery was beyond their imagination. The barnacle goose does not grow on trees or from shells. It hatches from eggs, just like any other bird. But its breeding grounds are located in the remote high Arctic. It nests on cliffs in faraway lands like Greenland and Svalbard. Each autumn, the entire population migrates thousands of miles south to the warmer climates of Europe. This epic journey was completely unknown to medieval science. So the incredible myth of the goose tree was a sincere attempt to solve a real puzzle. Faced with a bird that seemed to have no parents or home, they created a logical explanation based on what they could see. The legend shows a pre-scientific mind at work. It combined careful observation with creative imagination. The myth has been debunked, but it has been replaced by the equally wondrous and proven truth of epic seasonal migration. Let us now step into a clearing in an ancient European forest. A colossal figure made of woven wicker stands against the sky. It is shaped like a man, and inside its hollow limbs and torso are living people trapped like birds in a cage. As the sun sets, a torch is put to the structure. The wicker man erupts in flames. This is one of the most terrifying images associated with the ancient pagan world, a symbol of brutal human sacrifice. For many people today, the Wicker Man is a piece of modern horror fiction. It is most famous from a classic British horror film. The image feels like a nightmare, a dramatic invention designed to shock and frighten a modern audience. We might assume that this practice is a myth, a scary story about the supposed savagery of our pre-Christian ancestors. It seems too monstrous to have been a real historical practice. But the story of the Wicker Man is not a modern invention. The first and most famous description of it comes from a very credible historical source. The Roman general Julius Caesar, in his account of the Gallic Wars, Caesar wrote about the customs of the Celtic peoples he was conquering. He paid special attention to their priests, the learned and mysterious class known as the Druids. Caesar wrote that the Druids presided over public and private sacrifices. He claimed they believed that the gods could only be satisfied by the offering of a human life. He then described their most shocking ritual. He wrote that they would build immense figures from wicker. They would fill these effigies with living men. Then they would set the entire structure on fire. The victims would perish in a cage of roaring flames. For a long time, historians debated this account. Was Caesar telling the truth? Or was this just Roman propaganda? He had a clear motive to portray the Celts as barbaric savages. A brutal enemy is an enemy that deserves to be conquered and civilized by Rome. It was possible that Caesar was exaggerating or even inventing the story of the Wicker Man. He may have been using it to justify his own violent conquest. While we have never found the physical remains of a Wicker Man, archaeology has provided grim confirmation of the core of Caesar's story. The proven true part is not the wicker structure itself, but the practice it represents. Excavations across the Celtic world have proven beyond any doubt that ritual human sacrifice was a real and important part of their religion. The Romans were not making this up. The most compelling evidence comes from the bogs of northern Europe. The well-preserved bog bodies, like Lindo Man in England, tell a dark story. These were not people who died of natural causes. They were often killed in elaborate and brutal ways. They were strangled, stabbed, and bludgeoned in what appears to be a highly ritualized manner. This physical evidence strongly supports the written accounts of Roman and other classical authors. The Celts did kill people to honor their gods. So the legend of the Wicker Man is a specific and dramatic image. It represents a much broader and darker historical truth. While Caesar's account may be biased, it was not a complete fabrication. He was describing a real practice of human sacrifice that was central to the Celtic world. The terrifying myth of a burning wicker giant is rooted in a verifiable and brutal reality of the past. It is a chilling reminder of the chasm that separates our world from the ancient one. Let us now visit the muddy fields of northern France during the 100 Years' War. A small English army stands waiting. Opposite them is a vast and magnificent force of French knights in shining plate armor. The French are confident of victory, but the English have a legendary weapon. At their command, thousands of archers draw back their bowstrings. They unleash a storm of arrows that darkens the sky. This is the English longbow, a weapon famed for defeating the greatest armies of the age. The longbow has a mythical reputation. It is often portrayed as a great equalizer, a simple weapon that allowed the humble English yeoman to defeat the arrogant French noble. This creates a powerful and romantic story. It is a tale of the common man and his simple wooden bow, triumphing over the elite warrior class. The myth is that the longbow was a superweapon, a tool that made anyone a deadly soldier. But was a stick and a string really that powerful? Could it truly penetrate a knight's steel armor? For a long time, the sheer scale of the English victories at battles like Agincourt seemed almost unbelievable. The myth of the longbow as a simple peasant's tool is a misunderstanding. The historical reality is far more complex, and the truth of its effectiveness is even more impressive than the legend. The proven true part of the story begins with the weapon itself. A medieval war bow was not a light hunting weapon. It was a formidable piece of engineering. It was typically made from a single piece of yew wood. It was often as tall as the man who wielded it. The draw weight of these bows was immense. Modern reconstructions and analysis show they required 100 to 150 pounds of force to draw. This gave them incredible power and range. This power required a very special kind of soldier. A war bow was not a weapon you could learn to use in a few weeks. It required a lifetime of dedicated training. To build the necessary strength, archers had to start practicing as children. Skeletons of medieval longbowmen have been found by archaeologists. They show distinct physical traits. They have enlarged left arms and overdeveloped shoulder bones. These are the skeletal marks of years of pulling a powerful bow. The ammunition was just as specialized. English archers carried sheaves of arrows with different heads for different targets. Against a heavily armored knight, they would use a narrow armor-piercing point called a bodkin. A direct hit from a bodkin point at close range could potentially punch through thinner plate armor. More importantly, these arrows were devastating against the knight's horse. A fallen horse could trap a knight or create chaos in a charging formation. The true power of the longbow was not in single shots. It was in massed, disciplined volleys. An army of several thousand archers could fire tens of thousands of arrows in a single minute. This created a terrifying arrow storm that rained down on the enemy. This storm could break the spirit of an advancing army. It would disrupt their formations and inflict terrible casualties long before they ever reached the English lines. It was a system of shock and awe. So the legend of the all-powerful English longbow is true. It was a weapon that dominated the battlefields of the 14th and 15th centuries. But the myth of it being a simple peasant's weapon is false. Its success was the result of a complete military system. It combined a powerful weapon with a soldier who had trained his entire life to use it. The proof of its power is written in the pages of history and in the very bones of the men who drew the mighty bow. Let us now venture into a place of quiet dread, a medieval graveyard. Imagine a scene from a dark time. Villagers are exhuming a coffin, perhaps, due to fears of plague or some other dark suspicion. The coffin belongs to a woman who had died several months earlier while pregnant. They pry open the lid. Inside, they find something that chills them to the bone. Next to the mother's body lies the tiny corpse of an infant. A child seemingly born after its mother was already buried. To the medieval mind, this discovery could only have one explanation. It was a profoundly evil and supernatural event. This was not a natural birth. It was the work of the undead or the devil. The mother must have been a vampire. She had returned to a semblance of life in her coffin to give birth to an unholy child. This terrifying scene would confirm their deepest fears. It would become the basis for local legends of restless spirits and demonic births, a story told for generations in hushed whispers. This kind of event would have fed directly into existing folklore. In many cultures, a woman who died during pregnancy or childbirth was considered to be in a dangerous spiritual state. She was thought to be at high risk of becoming a vampire or a vengeful ghost. A discovery like a post-mortem birth would be seen as absolute proof of this sinister transformation. It was a physical sign of a supernatural horror, a tale of the grave itself being defiled by an unnatural life. For centuries, accounts of such events were dismissed by more rational thinkers. The idea of a corpse giving birth sounds like something from a Gothic horror novel. It is a trope used to shock and scare. Historical mentions of this phenomenon were likely seen as superstitious fantasy. They were the exaggerated tall tales of a credulous and fearful population. The coffin birth was surely a myth, a grotesque invention of a dark and unenlightened age. But this is one horror story that is absolutely true. The phenomenon is real. It is known in forensic science as post-mortem fetal extrusion. It is not supernatural at all. It is a rare but entirely natural consequence of the human body's decomposition process. The myth of an undead birth was an attempt to explain a real and deeply disturbing biological event. The science behind it is straightforward. After a person dies, the bacteria inside their body begin to break down the internal organs and tissues. This process of putrefaction creates a large amount of gas. These gases, including methane and carbon dioxide, become trapped inside the body's cavities. This causes the abdomen to become bloated and distended. An immense amount of internal pressure begins to build up. In the specific case of a deceased pregnant woman, this pressure can have a startling effect. The trapped gas in the abdomen pushes down on all the internal organs, including the uterus. If the pressure becomes strong enough, it can literally force the fetus out of the mother's body through the birth canal. It is not a living birth, and there is no life involved. It is a purely mechanical process, a tragic and gruesome artifact of death and decay. So the terrifying myth of the coffin birth is based on a real and verifiable phenomenon. The medieval villagers, who may have witnessed such a thing, were not lying. They were accurately describing what they saw. They simply lacked the scientific framework to understand the cause. They explained a shocking natural event with the only tools they had: supernatural belief. Modern science has since proven the event is real while dispelling the dark myths that once surrounded it. Let us now stand before the great monuments of the Roman Empire. Look at the majestic arches of the Colosseum. Gaze up at the magnificent coffered dome of the Pantheon. These structures have stood for nearly 2,000 years. They have endured earthquakes, wars, and the relentless forces of nature. Meanwhile, many modern concrete buildings begin to crumble after just a few decades. How did the Romans build things that lasted so long? For centuries, the answer was a legend, a myth of a lost secret formula for perfect concrete. This myth grew from a simple observation. Roman concrete was clearly different and vastly superior to anything made since. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the knowledge of how to make this incredible material was lost. For over 1,000 years, builders could not replicate its strength and longevity. Roman concrete became a mythical substance, a lost technology from a golden age of engineering. Its durability seemed almost magical, a secret that modern science struggled to understand. One of the most legendary properties of Roman concrete was its relationship with water. The Romans built massive harbors and breakwaters directly into the sea. Modern concrete structures quickly degrade and corrode in salt water. But Roman maritime concrete seemed to thrive in it. It actually grew stronger over time as it was exposed to the waves. This quality in particular seemed to defy the laws of chemistry. It was a key part of the material's mythical reputation. For centuries, historians knew one of the key ingredients from ancient texts. The Roman engineer Vitruvius wrote that they used a special type of volcanic ash. It was called pozzolana, from the region around Mount Vesuvius. But simply mixing volcanic ash with modern cement did not reproduce the Roman results. The exact chemical magic remained a mystery. The secret ingredient was known, but the recipe was still lost to the ages. The final secrets were only unlocked in the 21st century. Using advanced scientific tools like X-ray analysis, scientists were able to study Roman concrete at the molecular level. They examined samples taken from ancient seawalls and piers. They finally saw the unique mineral structures that gave the concrete its incredible strength and longevity. The myth of a lost secret was about to be proven true in a spectacular fashion. The analysis revealed something astonishing. Roman concrete had the ability to heal itself. When tiny cracks would form in the concrete over time, seawater would seep inside. This water would trigger a chemical reaction with the pozzolanic material. The reaction would grow new interlocking crystals. These crystals would spread through the cracks, filling them and reinforcing the structure from within. The concrete was literally healing its own wounds. A more recent discovery has added another layer to this incredible technology. Researchers noticed small white chunks embedded in the concrete which they called lime clasts. These were once thought to be a sign of sloppy mixing, but it turns out they were a crucial and intentional ingredient. When a crack forms and water enters, these lime clasts dissolve. They create a calcium-rich solution that quickly recrystallizes, sealing the crack. This provided a second, faster method of self-repair. So the legend of a lost Roman superconcrete is absolutely true. It was not a myth. The Romans were brilliant engineers who had created a durable, sustainable, and self-healing building material. Their magnificent structures have survived not by chance, but by design. By finally understanding this ancient secret, modern scientists are now trying to create a new generation of concrete for our own time, a technology that could build a more sustainable future by learning from the proven genius of the past. Our long journey through the mists of time is now coming to an end. We have walked through the ruins of sunken cities. We have stood with armies on ancient battlefields. We have uncovered the lost sciences of our ancestors. We have seen how the line between myth and reality is often a faint and shifting one. The legends of the past are not always simple fictions. They are often the echoes of a forgotten truth. Throughout our exploration, we have seen how history is a story that is always being rewritten. A new discovery in a forgotten bog, a scientific analysis of a mysterious manuscript, an archaeological dig on a remote hillside. Each new piece of evidence can challenge what we thought we knew. It can transform a fairy tale into a historical fact. It proves that the past is never truly dead. It is merely waiting to be rediscovered. These stories do more than just solve ancient puzzles. They connect us to the people who came before us. They were people who tried to make sense of a mysterious world. They created myths to explain the unexplainable. They told stories to remember great triumphs and terrible tragedies. Their legends are a testament to their creativity, their fears, and their profound sense of wonder. They are a window into the human imagination itself. So let these stories of proven myths settle in your mind. Let them be a reminder that there are always new secrets to uncover. The past is a vast and quiet landscape filled with sleeping truths. and every now and then we are lucky enough to watch one of them awake. Thank you for joining us on this journey at Medieval Nocturnes. If you have enjoyed our exploration into the quiet corners of history, please consider subscribing so you do not miss our future travels into the past. We hope you have found this journey relaxing and informative. Until next time, rest well.